This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Antichrist by Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Translated from the German with an introduction by H. L. Mencken. Copyright 1918 by Alfred A. Knopf, Incorporated. Introduction by H. L. Mencken. Save for his raucous, rhapsodical autobiography, Ecce Homo, the Antichrist is the last thing that Nietzsche ever wrote, and so it may be accepted as a statement of some of his most salient ideas in their final form. Notes for it had been accumulating for years, and it was to have constituted the first volume of his long-projected magnum opus, The Will to Power. His full plan for this work, as originally drawn up, was as follows. Volume 1, The Antichrist, an attempt at a criticism of Christianity. Volume 2, The Free Spirit, a criticism of philosophy as a nihilistic movement. Volume 3, The Immoralist, a criticism of morality, the most fatal form of ignorance. Volume 4, Dionysus, the philosophy of eternal recurrence. The first sketches for The Will to Power were made in 1884, soon after the publication of the first 3 parts of Thus Spake Zarathustra, and thereafter, for 4 years, Nietzsche piled up notes. They were written at all the places he visited on his endless travels in search of health: at Nice, at Venice, at Sils Maria in the Engadine, for long his favorite resort, at Cannobio, at Zurich, at Genoa, at Chur, at Leipzig. Several times his work was interrupted by other books, first by Beyond Good and Evil, then by The Genealogy of Morals, written in 20 days, then by his Wagner pamphlets. Almost as often he changed his plan. Once he decided to expand The Will to Power to 10 volumes, with An Attempt at a New Interpretation of the World as a general subtitle. Again he adopted the subtitle of An Interpretation of All That Happens. Finally, he hit upon An Attempt at Transvaluation of All Values, and went back to 4 volumes, though with a number of changes in their arrangement. In September 1888 he began actual work upon the first volume, and before the end of the month it was completed. The summer had been one of almost hysterical creative activity. Since the middle of June he had written 2 other small books, The Case of Wagner and The Twilight of the Idols, and before the end of the year he was destined to write Ecce Homo. Some time during December his health began to fail rapidly, and soon after the New Year he was helpless. Thereafter he wrote no more. The Wagner diatribe and The Twilight of the Idols were published immediately, but the Antichrist did not get into type until 1895. I suspect that the delay was due to the influence of the philosopher's sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, an intelligent and ardent, but by no means uniformly judicious propagandist of his ideas. During his dark days of neglect and misunderstanding, when even family and friends kept aloof, Frau Forster Nietzsche went with him farther than any other, but there were bounds beyond which she, also, hesitated to go, and those bounds were marked by crosses. One notes, in her biography of him, a useful but not always accurate work, an evident desire to purge him of the accusation of mocking at sacred things. He had, she says, great admiration for, quote, the elevating effect of Christianity upon the weak and ailing, unquote, and, quote, a real liking for sincere pious Christians, unquote, and, quote, a tender love for the founder of Christianity, unquote. All his wrath, she continues, was reserved for, quote, St. Paul and his like, unquote, who perverted the Beatitudes which Christ intended for the lowly only, into a universal religion which made war upon aristocratic values. Here, obviously, one is addressed by an interpreter who cannot forget that she is the daughter of a Lutheran pastor and the granddaughter of 2 others. A touch of conscience gets into her reading of the Antichrist. She even hints that the text may have been garbled, after the author's collapse, by some more sinister heretic. There is not the slightest reason to believe that any such garbling ever took place, nor is there any evidence that their common heritage of piety rested upon the brother as heavily as it rested upon the sister. On the contrary, it must be manifest that Nietzsche, in this book, intended to attack Christianity headlong and with all arms, that for all his rapid writing he put the utmost care into it, and that he wanted it to be printed exactly as it stands. The ideas in it were anything but new to him, when he set them down. He had been developing them since the days of his beginning. You will find some of them clearly recognizable in the first book he ever wrote, The Birth of Tragedy. You will find the most important of all of them, the conception of Christianity as ressentiment, set forth at length in the first part of the Genealogy of Morals, published under his own supervision in 1887, and the rest are scattered through the whole vast mass of his notes, sometimes as mere questionings, but often worked out very carefully. Moreover, let it not be forgotten that it was Wagner's yielding to Christian sentimentality in Parsifal that transformed Nietzsche from the first among his literary advocates into the most bitter of his opponents. He could forgive every other sort of mountebankery, but not that. "In me," he once said, quote, "the Christianity of my forebears reaches its logical conclusion. In me, the stern intellectual conscience that Christianity fosters and makes paramount turns against Christianity. In me, Christianity devours itself." Unquote. In truth, the present Philippic is as necessary to the completeness of the whole of Nietzsche's system as the keystone is to the arch. All the curves of his speculation lead up to it. What he flung himself against from beginning to end of his days of writing was always, in the last analysis, Christianity in some form or other. Christianity as a system of practical ethics, Christianity as a political code, Christianity as metaphysics, Christianity as a gauge of the truth. It would be difficult to think of any intellectual enterprise on his long list that did not, more or less directly and clearly, relate itself to this master enterprise of them all. It was as if his apostasy from the faith of his fathers, filling him with the fiery zeal of the convert, and particularly of the convert to heresy, had blinded him to every other element in the gigantic self-delusion of civilized man. The will to power was his answer to Christianity's affectation of humility and self-sacrifice. Eternal recurrence was his mocking criticism of Christian optimism and millennialism. The Superman was his candidate for the place of the Christian ideal of the good man, prudently abased before the throne of God. The things he chiefly argued for were anti-Christian things: the abandonment of the purely moral view of life, the rehabilitation of instinct, the dethronement of weakness and timidity as ideals, the renunciation of the whole hocus-pocus of dogmatic religion, the extermination of false aristocracies, of the priest, of the politician, of the plutocrat, the revival of the healthy, lordly innocence that was Greek. If he was anything, in a word, Nietzsche was a Greek born 2,000 years too late. His dreams were thoroughly Hellenic. His whole manner of thinking was Hellenic. His peculiar errors were Hellenic no less. But his Hellenism, I need not add, was anything but the pale Neoplatonism that has run like a thread through the thinking of the Western world since the days of the Christian Fathers. From Plato, to be sure, he got what all of us must get, but his real forefather was Heraclitus. It is in Heraclitus that one finds the germ of his primary view of the universe, a view, to wit, that sees it not as moral phenomenon, but as mere aesthetic representation. The God that Nietzsche imagined, in the end, was not far from the God that such an artist as Joseph Conrad imagines, a supreme craftsman ever experimenting, ever coming closer to an ideal balancing of lines and forces, and yet always failing to work out the final harmony. The late war, awakening all the primitive racial fury of the Western nations, and therewith all their ancient enthusiasm for religious taboos and sanctions, naturally focused attention upon Nietzsche as upon the most daring and provocative of recent amateur theologians. The Germans, with their characteristic tendency to explain their every act in terms as realistic and unpleasant as possible, appear to have mauled him in a belated and unexpected embrace, to the horror, I dare say, of the Kaiser, and perhaps to the even greater horror of Nietzsche's own ghost. The folks of Anglo-Saxondom with their equally characteristic tendency to explain all their enterprises romantically, simultaneously set him up as the Antichrist he no doubt secretly longed to be. The result was a great deal of misrepresentation and misunderstanding of him. From the pulpits of the Allied countries, and particularly from those of England and the United States, a horde of patriotic ecclesiastics denounced him in extravagant terms as the author of all the horrors of the time, and in the newspapers, until the Kaiser was elected sole bugaboo, he shared the honors of that office with von Hindenburg, the Crown Prince, Captain Boy Ed, von Bernstorff, and von Tirpitz. Most of this denunciation, of course, was frankly idiotic. The naive pish-posh of suburban Methodists, notoriety-seeking college professors, almost illiterate editorial writers, and other such numbskulls. In much of it, including not a few official hymns of hate, Nietzsche was gravely discovered to be the teacher of such spokesmen of the extremist sort of German nationalism as von Bernhardi and von Treitschke, which was just as intelligent as making George Bernard Shaw the mentor of Lloyd George. In other solemn pronunciamientos he was credited with being philosophically responsible for various imaginary crimes of the enemy, the wholesale slaughter or mutilation of prisoners of war, the deliberate burning down of Red Cross hospitals, the utilization of the corpses of the slain for soap-making. I amused myself in those gaudy days by collecting newspaper clippings to this general effect, and later on I shall probably publish a digest of them as a contribution to the study of war hysteria. The thing went to unbelievable lengths. On the strength of the fact that I had published a book on Nietzsche in 1906, 6 years after his death, I was called upon by agents of the Department of Justice, elaborately outfitted with badges, to meet the charge that I was an intimate associate and agent of, quote, the German monster Nietzsche, unquote. I quote the official procès-verbal, an indignant but often misspelled document. Alas, poor Nietzsche! After all his laborious efforts to prove that he was not a German but a Pole, even after his heroic readiness, via anti-Semitism, to meet the deduction that, if a Pole, then probably also a Jew. But under all this alarmed and preposterous tosh there was at least a sound instinct, and that was the instinct which recognized Nietzsche as the most eloquent, pertinacious, and effective of all the critics of the philosophy to which the Allies against Germany stood committed, and on the strength of which, at all events in theory, the United States had engaged itself in the war. He was not, in point of fact, involved with the visible enemy, save in remote and transient ways. The German, officially, remained the most ardent of Christians during the war, and became a democrat at its close. But he was plainly a foe of democracy in all its forms, political, religious, and epistemological, and what is worse, his opposition was set forth in terms that were not only extraordinarily penetrating and devastating, but also uncommonly offensive. It was thus quite natural that he should have aroused a degree of indignation verging upon the pathological in the two countries that had planted themselves upon the democratic platform most boldly, and that felt it most shaky, one may add, under their feet. I dare say that Nietzsche, had he been alive, would have got a lot of satisfaction out of the execration thus heaped upon him, not only because, being a vain fellow, he enjoyed execration as a tribute to his general singularity, and hence to his superiority, but also, and more importantly, because, being no mean psychologist, he would have recognized the disconcerting doubts underlying it. If Nietzsche's criticism of democracy were as ignorant and empty, say, as the average evangelical clergyman's criticism of Darwin's hypothesis of natural selection, then the advocates of democracy could afford to dismiss it as loftily as the Darwinians dismissed the blather of the holy clerks. And if his attack upon Christianity were mere sound and fury signifying nothing, then there would be no call for anathemas from the sacred desk. But these onslaughts, in point of fact, have behind them a tremendous learning and a great deal of point and plausibility. There are, in brief, bullets in the gun, teeth in the tiger, and so it is no wonder that they excite the ire of men who hold as a primary article of belief that their acceptance would destroy civilization, darken the sun, and bring Yahweh to sobs upon his throne. But in all this justifiable fear, of course, there remains a false assumption, and that is the assumption that Nietzsche proposed to destroy Christianity altogether, and so rob the plain people of the world of their virtue, their spiritual consolations, and their hope of heaven. Nothing could be more untrue. The fact is that Nietzsche had no interest whatever in the delusions of the plain people, that is, intrinsically. It seemed to him of small moment what they believed, so long as it was safely imbecile. What he stood against was not their beliefs, but the elevation of those beliefs by any sort of democratic process to the dignity of a state philosophy. What he feared most was the pollution and crippling of the superior minority by intellectual disease from below. His plain aim in the Antichrist was to combat that menace by completing the work begun, on the one hand, by Darwin and the other evolutionist philosophers, and, on the other hand, by German historians and philologians. The net effect of this earlier attack in the '80s had been the collapse of Christian theology as a serious concern of educated men. The mob, it must be obvious, was very little shaken. Even to this day it has not put off its belief in the essential Christian doctrines. But the intelligentsia, by 1885, had been pretty well convinced. No man of sound information, at the time Nietzsche planned the Antichrist, actually believed that the world was created in 7 days, or that its fauna was once overwhelmed by flood as a penalty for the sins of man, or that Noah saved the boa constrictor, the prairie dog, and the pediculus capitis by taking a pair of each into the ark, or that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, or that a fragment of the true cross could cure hydrophobia. Such notions, still almost universally prevalent in Christendom a century before, were now confined to the great body of ignorant and credulous men, that is, to 95 or 96% of the race. For a man of the superior minority to subscribe to one of them publicly was already sufficient to set him off as one in imminent need of psychiatrical attention. Belief in them had become a mark of inferiority, like the allied belief in madstones, magic, and apparitions. But though the theology of Christianity had thus sunk to the lowly estate of a mere delusion of the rabble, propagated on that level by the ancient caste of sacerdotal parasites, the ethics of Christianity continued to enjoy the utmost acceptance, and perhaps even more acceptance than ever before. It seemed to be generally felt, in fact, that they simply must be saved from the wreck, that the world would vanish into chaos if they went the way of the revelations supporting them. In this fear a great many judicious men joined, and so there arose what was, in essence, an absolutely new Christian cult, a cult, to wit, purged of all the supernaturalism superimposed upon the older cult by generations of theologians, and harking back to what was conceived to be the pure ethical doctrine of Jesus. This cult still flourishes. Protestantism tends to become identical with it. It invades Catholicism as modernism. It is supported by great numbers of men whose intelligence is manifest and whose sincerity is not open to question. Even Nietzsche himself yielded to it in weak moments, as you will discover on examining his somewhat laborious effort to make Paul the villain of Christian theology, and Jesus no more than an innocent bystander. But this sentimental yielding never went far enough to distract his attention for long from his main idea, which was this: that Christian ethics were quite as dubious at bottom as Christian theology, that they were founded just as surely as such childish fables as the story of Jonah and the whale, upon the peculiar prejudices and credulities, the special desires and appetites of inferior men, that they warred upon the best interests of men of a better sort, quite as unmistakably as the most extravagant of objective superstitions. In brief, what he saw in Christian ethics, under all the poetry, and all the fine show of altruism, and all the theoretical benefits therein, was a democratic effort to curb the egoism of the strong, a conspiracy of the Chandala against the free functioning of their superiors, nay, against the free progress of mankind. This theory is the thing he exposes in the Antichrist, bringing to the business his amazing chromatic and exigent eloquence at its finest flower. This is the, quote, conspiracy, unquote, He sets forth in all the panoply of his characteristic italics, dashes, sforzando interjections, and exclamation points. Well, an idea is an idea. The present one may be right, and it may be wrong. One thing is quite certain, that no progress will be made against it by denouncing it as merely immoral. If it is ever laid at all, it must be laid evidentially, logically. The notion to the contrary is thoroughly democratic. The mob is the most ruthless of tyrants. It is always in a democratic society that heresy and felony tend to be most constantly confused. One hears without surprise of a Bismarck philosophizing placidly, at least in his old age, upon the delusion of socialism, and of a Friedrich the Great playing the hose of his cynicism upon the absolutism that was almost identical with his own person; but men in the mass never brook the destructive discussion of their fundamental beliefs, and that impatience is naturally most evident in those societies in which men in the mass are most influential. Democracy and free speech are not facets of one gem. Democracy and free speech are eternal enemies. But in any battle between an institution and an idea, the idea, in the long run, has the better of it. Here I do not venture into the absurdity of arguing that, as the world wags on, the truth always survives. I believe nothing of the sort. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that an idea that happens to be true, or, more exactly, as near to truth as any human idea can be, and yet remain generally intelligible, it seems to me that such an idea carries a special and often fatal handicap. The majority of men prefer delusion to truth. It soothes, it is easy to grasp. Above all, it fits more snugly than the truth into a universe of false appearances, of complex and irrational phenomena, defectively grasped. But though an idea that is true is thus not likely to prevail, an idea that is attacked enjoys a great advantage. The evidence behind it is now supported by sympathy, the sporting instinct, sentimentality; and sentimentality is as powerful as an army with banners. One never hears of a martyr in history whose notions are seriously disputed today. The forgotten ideas are those of the men who put them forward soberly and quietly, hoping fatuously that they would conquer by the force of their truth. These are the ideas that we now struggle to rediscover. Had Nietzsche lived to be burned at the stake by outraged Mississippi Methodists, it would have been a glorious day for his doctrines. As it is, they are helped on their way every time they are denounced as immoral and against God. The war brought down upon them the maledictions of vast herds of right-thinking men. And now the Antichrist, after 15 years of neglect, is being reprinted. One imagines the author, a sardonic wraith, snickering somewhat sadly over the fact. His shade, wherever it suffers, is favored in these days by many such consolations, some of them of much greater horsepower. Think of the facts and arguments, even the underlying theories and attitudes, that have been borrowed from him, consciously and unconsciously, by the foes of Bolshevism during these last thrilling years. The face of democracy, suddenly seen hideously close, has scared the guardians of the reigning plutocracy half to death, and they have gone to the devil himself for aid. Southern senators, almost illiterate men, have mixed his acids with well water, and spouted them like affrighted geysers, not knowing what they did. Nor are they the first to borrow from him. Years ago I called attention to the debt incurred, with characteristic forgetfulness of obligation, by the late Theodore Roosevelt in The Strenuous Life and elsewhere. Roosevelt, a typical apologist for the existing order, adeptly dragging a herring across the trail whenever it was menaced, yet managed to delude the native boobery, at least until toward the end, into accepting him as a fiery exponent of pure democracy. Perhaps he even fooled himself. Charlatans usually do so, soon or late. A study of Nietzsche reveals the sources of much that was honest in him, and exposes the hollowness of much that was sham. Nietzsche, an infinitely harder and more courageous intellect, was incapable of any such confusion of ideas. He seldom allowed sentimentality to turn him from the glaring fact. What is called Bolshevism today, he saw clearly a generation ago, and described for what it was and is. Democracy in another aspect. The old ressentiment of the lower orders in free function once more. Socialism, Puritanism, Philistinism, Christianity, he saw them all as allotropic forms of democracy, as variations upon the endless struggle of quantity against quality, of the weak and timorous against the strong and enterprising, of the botched against the fit. The world needed a staggering exaggeration to make it see even half of the truth. It trembles today as it trembled during the French Revolution. Perhaps it would tremble less if it could combat the monster with a clearer conscience and less burden of compromising theory, if it could launch its forces frankly at the fundamental doctrine, and not merely employ them to police the transient orgy. Nietzsche, in the long run, may help it toward that greater honesty. His notions, propagated by cuttings from cuttings from cuttings, may conceivably prepare the way for a sounder, more healthful theory of society and of the state, and so free human progress from the stupidities which now hamper it, and men of true vision from the despairs which now sicken them. I say it is conceivable, but I doubt that it is probable. The soul and the belly of mankind are too evenly balanced. It is not likely that the belly will ever put away its hunger or forget its power. Here, perhaps, there is an example of the eternal recurrence that Nietzsche was fond of mulling over in his blacker moods. We are in the midst of one of the perennial risings of the lower orders. It got under way long before any of the current Bolshevist demons was born. It was given its long, secure start by the intolerable tyranny of the plutocracy, the end product of the 18th century revolt against the old aristocracy. It found resistance suddenly slackened by civil war within the plutocracy itself, one gang of traitors falling upon another gang, to the tune of vast hymn-singing and yells to God. Perhaps it has already passed its apogee. The plutocracy, chastened, shows signs of a new solidarity. The wheel continues to swing round. But this combat between proletariat and plutocracy is, after all, itself a civil war. Two inferiorities struggle for the privilege of polluting the world. What actual difference does it make to a civilized man when there is a steel strike, whether the workmen win or the mill owners win? The conflict can interest him only as spectacle, as the conflict between Bonaparte and the old order in Europe interests Goethe and Beethoven. The victory, whichever way it goes, will simply bring chaos nearer, and so set the stage for a genuine revolution later on, with, let us hope, a new feudalism or something better coming out of it, and a new 13th century at dawn. This seems to be the slow, costly way of the worst of habitable worlds. In the present case, my money is laid upon the plutocracy. It will win because it will be able, in the long run, to enlist the finer intelligences. The mob and its maudlin causes attract only sentimentalists and scoundrels, chiefly the latter. Politics, under a democracy, reduces itself to a mere struggle for office by flatterers of the proletariat. Even when a superior man prevails at that disgusting game, he must prevail at the cost of his self-respect. Not many superior men make the attempt. The average great captain of the rabble, when he is not simply a weeper over irremediable wrongs, is a hypocrite, so far gone that he is unconscious of his own hypocrisy, a slimy fellow offensive to the nose. The plutocracy can recruit measurably more respectable janissaries, if only because it can make self-interest less obviously costly to amour propre. Its defect and its weakness lie in the fact that it is still too young to have acquired dignity. But lately sprung from the mob it now preys upon, it yet shows some of the habits of mind of that mob. It is blatant, stupid, ignorant, lacking in all delicate instinct and governmental finesse. Above all, it remains somewhat heavily moral. One seldom finds it undertaking one of its characteristic imbecilities without offering a sonorous moral reason. It spends almost as much to support the Y.M.C.A., vice-crusading, prohibition, and other such puerilities as it spends upon congressmen, strike-breakers, gunmen, kept patriots, and newspapers. In England the case is even worse. It is almost impossible to find a wealthy industrial over there who is not also an eminent nonconformist layman, and even among financiers there are praying brothers. On the continent the day is saved by the fact that the plutocracy tends to become more and more Jewish. Here the intellectual cynicism of the Jew almost counterbalances his social unpleasantness. If he is destined to leave the plutocracy of the world out of Little Bethel, he will fail, of course, to turn it into an aristocracy, i.e., a caste of gentlemen. But he will at least make it clever and hence worthy of consideration. The case against the Jews is long and damning. It would justify 10,000 times as many pogroms as now go on in the world. But whenever you find a Davidsbündlerschaft making practice against the Philistines, there you will find a Jew laying on. Maybe it was this fact that caused Nietzsche to speak up for the children of Israel quite as often as he spoke against them. He was not blind to their faults, but when he set them beside Christians, he could not deny their general superiority. Perhaps in America and England, as on the continent, the increasing Jewishness of the plutocracy, while cutting it off from all chance of ever developing into an aristocracy, will yet lift it to such a dignity that it will at least deserve a certain grudging respect. But even so, it will remain in a sort of half-world, midway between the gutter and the stars. Above it will still stand the small group of men that constitutes the permanent aristocracy of the race, the men of imagination and high purpose, the makers of genuine progress, the brave and ardent spirits, above all petty fears and discontents, and above all petty hopes and ideals no less. There were heroes before Agamemnon, there will be Bachs after Johann Sebastian. And beneath the Judaized plutocracy, the sublimated bourgeoisie, there the immemorial proletariat, I venture to guess, will roar on, endlessly tortured by its vain hatreds and envies, stampeded and made to tremble by its ancient superstitions, prodded and made miserable by its sordid and degrading hopes. It seems to me very likely that in this proletariat Christianity will continue to survive. It is nonsense, true enough, but it is sweet. Nietzsche, denouncing its dangers as a poison, almost falls into the error of denying it its undoubtedly sugary smack. Of all the religions ever devised by the great practical jokers of the race, this is the one that offers most for the least money, so to speak, to the inferior man. It starts out by denying his inferiority in plain terms. All men are equal in the sight of God. It ends by erecting that inferiority into a sort of actual superiority. It is a merit to be stupid and miserable and sorely put upon. Of such are the celestial elect. Not all the eloquence of a million Nietzsches, nor all the painful marshalling of evidence of a million Darwins and Harnacks, will ever empty that great consolation of its allure. The most they can ever accomplish is to make the superior orders of men acutely conscious of the exact nature of it, and so give them armament against the contagion. This is going on, this is being done. I think that the Antichrist has a useful place in that enterprise. It is strident, it is often extravagant, it is, to many sensitive men, in the worst of possible taste, but at bottom it is enormously apt and effective, and on the surface it is undoubtedly a good show. One somehow enjoys, with the malice that is native to man, the spectacle of anathemas batted back. It is refreshing to see the pitchfork employed against gentlemen who have doomed such innumerable caravans to hell. In Nietzsche they found, after many long years, a foeman worthy of them, not a mere fancy swordsman like Voltaire, or a mob orator like Tom Paine, or a pedant like the heretics of exegesis, but a gladiator armed with steel and armored with steel, and showing all the ferocious gusto of a medieval bishop. It is a pity that Holy Church has no process for the elevation of demons, like its process for the canonization of saints. There must be a long roll of black miracles to the discredit of the accursed Friedrich, sinners purged of conscience and made happy in their sinning, clerics shaken in their theology by visions of a new and better holy city, the strong made to exult, the weak robbed of their old sad romance. It would be a pleasure to see the Advocatus Diaboli turn from the table of the prosecution to the table of the defense, and move in solemn form for the damnation of the Naumburg hobgoblin. Of all Nietzsche's books, the Antichrist comes nearest to conventionality in form. It presents a connected argument with very few interludes, and has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Most of his works are in the form of collections of apothegms, and sometimes the subject changes on every second page. This fact constitutes one of the counts in the orthodox indictment of him. It is cited as proof that his capacity for consecutive thought was limited, and that he was thus deficient mentally, and perhaps a downright moron. The argument, it must be obvious, is fundamentally nonsensical. What deceives the professors is the traditional prolixity of philosophers, because the average philosophical writer, when he essays to expose his ideas, makes such inordinate drafts upon the parts of speech that the dictionary is almost emptied. These defective observers jump to the conclusion that his intrinsic notions are of corresponding weight. This is not unseldom quite untrue. What makes philosophy so garrulous is not the profundity of philosophers, but their lack of art. They are like physicians who sought to cure a slight hyperacidity by giving the patient a carload of burned oyster shells to eat. There is, too, the endless poll-parroting that goes on. Each new philosopher must prove his learning by laboriously rehearsing the ideas of all previous philosophers. Nietzsche avoided both faults. He always assumed that his readers knew the books, and that it was thus unnecessary to rewrite them. And having an idea that seemed to him to be novel and original, he stated it in as few words as possible, and then shut down. Sometimes he got it into 100 words, sometimes it took 1,000. Now and then, as in the present case, he developed a series of related ideas into a connected book. But he never wrote a word too many. He never pumped up an idea to make it appear bigger than it actually was. The pedagogues, alas, are not accustomed to that sort of writing in serious fields. They resent it, and sometimes they even try to improve it. There exists, in fact, a huge and solemn tome on Nietzsche by a learned man of America, in which all of his brilliancy is painfully translated into the windy phrases of the seminaries. The tome is satisfactorily ponderous, but the meat of the coconut is left out. There is actually no discussion of the Nietzschean view of Christianity. Always Nietzsche daunts the pedants. He employed too few words for them, and he had too many ideas. The present translation of the Antichrist is published by agreement with Dr. Oscar Levy, editor of the English edition of Nietzsche. There are two earlier translations, one by Thomas Common and the other by Anthony M. Ludovici. That of Mr. Common follows the text very closely, and thus occasionally shows some essentially German turns of phrase. That of Mr. Ludovici is more fluent, but rather less exact. I do not offer my own version on the plea that either of these is useless. On the contrary, I cheerfully acknowledge that they have much merit, and that they helped me at almost every line. I began this new Englishing of the book, not in any hope of supplanting them, and surely not with any notion of meeting a great public need, but simply as a private amusement in troubled days. But as I got on with it, I began to see ways of putting some flavor of Nietzsche's peculiar style into the English, and so amusement turned into a more or less serious labor. The result, of course, is far from satisfactory, but it at least represents a very diligent attempt. Nietzsche, always under the influence of French models, wrote a German that differs materially from any other German that I know. It is more nervous, more varied, more rapid in tempo. It runs to more effective climaxes. It is never stodgy. His marks begin to show upon the writing of the younger Germans of today. They are getting away from the old thunderous manner, with its long sentences and its tedious grammatical complexities. In the course of time, I dare say, they will develop a German almost as clear as French and almost as colorful and resilient as English. I owe thanks to Dr. Levy for his imprimatur, to Mr. Theodor Hemberger for criticism, and to Messrs. Common and Ludovici for showing me the way around many a difficulty. H. L. Mencken. End of the introduction to The Antichrist by H. L. Mencken.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Antichrist by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated from the German with an introduction by H.L. Mencken. Section 2, Preface. Read by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, January 2007. Preface. This book belongs to the most rare of men. Perhaps not one of them is yet alive. It is possible that they may be among those who understand my Zarathustra. How could I confound myself with those who are now sprouting ears? First, the day after tomorrow must come for me. Some men are born posthumously. The conditions under which anyone understands me, and necessarily understands me, I know them only too well. Even to endure my seriousness, my passion, he must carry intellectual integrity to the verge of hardness. He must be accustomed to living on mountain tops, and to looking upon the wretched gabble of politics and nationalism as beneath him. He must have become indifferent. He must never ask of the truth, whether it brings profit to him or a fatality to him. He must have an inclination born of strength for questions that no one has the courage for. The courage for the forbidden, predestination for the labyrinth. The experience of 7 solitudes. New ears for new music, new eyes for what is most distant. A new conscience for truths that have hitherto remained unheard, and the will to economize in the grand manner, to hold together his strength, his enthusiasm. Reverence for self, love of self, absolute freedom of self. Very well then. Of that sort only are my readers, my true readers, my readers foreordained. Of what account are the rest? The rest are merely humanity. One must make oneself superior to humanity, in power, in loftiness of soul, in contempt. Friedrich W. Nietzsche. End of Antichrist by Friedrich W. Nietzsche, translated from the German with an introduction by H.L. Mencken. Read by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, January 2007.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Antichrist by Friedrich Nietzsche. Translated by H.L. Mencken. Section 1. Let us look each other in the face. We are Hyperboreans. We know well enough how remote our place is. Neither by land nor by water will you find the road to the Hyperboreans. Even Pindar in his day knew that much about us. Footnote. Confer the 10th Pythian Ode, see also the 4th book of Herodotus. The Hyperboreans were a mythical people beyond the Rhipaean mountains, in the far north. They enjoyed unbroken happiness and perpetual youth. End footnote. Beyond the north, beyond the ice, beyond death, our life, our happiness. We have discovered that happiness, we know the way. We got our knowledge of it from thousands of years in the labyrinth. Who else has found it? The man of today? I don't know either the way out or the way in. I am whatever doesn't know either the way out or the way in, so sighs the man of today. This is the sort of modernity that made us ill. We sickened on lazy peace, cowardly compromise, the whole virtuous dirtiness of the modern yea and nay. This tolerance and largeur of the heart that forgives everything because it understands everything is a sirocco to us. Rather live amid the ice than among modern virtues and other such south winds. We were brave enough, we spared neither ourselves nor others, but we were a long time finding out where to direct our courage. We grew dismal. They called us fatalists. Our fate. It was the fullness, the tension, the storing up of powers. We thirsted for the lightnings and great deeds. We kept as far as possible from the happiness of the weakling, from resignation. There was thunder in our air. Nature, as we embodied it, became overcast, for we had not yet found the way. The formula of our happiness, a yea, a nay, a straight line, a goal. Section 2. What is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself, in man. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. Not contentment, but more power. Not peace at any price, but war. Not virtue, but efficiency. Virtue in the Renaissance sense. Virtue, free of moral acid. The weak and the botched shall perish, first principle of our charity, and one should help them to it. What is more harmful than any vice? Practical sympathy for the botched and the weak. Christianity. Section 3. The problem that I set here is not what shall replace mankind in the order of living creatures. Man is an end. But what type of man must be bred, must be willed, as being the most valuable, the most worthy of life, the most secure guarantee of the future? This more valuable type has appeared often enough in the past, but always as a happy accident, as an exception, never as deliberately willed. Very often it has been precisely the most feared. Hitherto it has been almost the terror of terrors. And out of that terror the contrary type has been willed, cultivated and attained. The domestic animal, the herd animal, the sick brute man, the Christian. Section 4. Mankind surely does not represent an evolution towards a better or stronger or higher level, as progress is now understood. This progress is merely a modern idea, which is to say, a false idea. The European of today, in his essential worth, falls far below the European of the Renaissance. The process of evolution does not necessarily mean elevation, enhancement, strengthening. True enough, it succeeds in isolated and individual cases in various parts of the earth and under the most widely different cultures. And in these cases, a higher type certainly manifests itself, something which, compared to mankind in the mass, appears as a sort of Superman. Such happy strokes of high success have always been possible, and will remain possible, perhaps, for all time to come. Even whole races, tribes, and nations may occasionally represent such lucky accidents. Section 5. We should not deck out and embellish Christianity. It has waged a war to the death against this higher type of man. It has put all the deepest instincts of this type under its ban. It has developed its concept of evil, of the evil one himself. Out of these instincts, the strong man as the typical reprobate, the outcast among men. Christianity has taken the part of all the weak, the low, the botched. It has made an ideal out of antagonism to all the self-preservative instincts of sound life. It has corrupted even the faculties of those natures that are intellectually most vigorous, by representing the highest intellectual values as sinful, as misleading, as full of temptation. The most lamentable example, the corruption of Pascal, who believed that his intellect had been destroyed by original sin, whereas it was actually destroyed by Christianity. Section 6. It is a painful and tragic spectacle that rises before me. I have drawn back the curtain from the rottenness of man. This word, in my mouth, is at least free from one suspicion, that it involves a moral accusation against humanity. It is used, and I wish to emphasize the fact again, without any moral significance. And this is so far true that the rottenness I speak of is most apparent to me precisely in those quarters where there has been most aspiration, hitherto, toward virtue and godliness. As you probably surmise, I understand rottenness in the sense of décadence. My argument is that all the values on which mankind now fixes its highest aspirations are décadence values. I call an animal, a species, an individual, corrupt, when it loses its instincts, when it chooses, when it prefers what is injurious to it. A history of the higher feelings, the ideals of humanity, and it is possible that I'll have to write it, would almost explain why man is so degenerate. Life itself appears to me as an instinct for growth, for survival, for the accumulation of forces, for power. Whenever the will to power fails, there is disaster. My contention is that all the highest values of humanity have been emptied of this will, that the values of décadence, of nihilism, now prevail under the holiest names. Section 7. Christianity is called the religion of pity. Pity stands in opposition to all the tonic passions that augment the energy of the feeling of aliveness. It is a depressant. A man loses power when he pities. Through pity, that drain upon strength which suffering works is multiplied 1,000-fold. Suffering is made contagious by pity. Under certain circumstances, it may lead to a total sacrifice of life and living energy, a loss out of all proportion to the magnitude of the cause. The case of the death of the Nazarene. This is the first view of it. There is, however, a still more important one. If one measures the effects of pity by the gravity of the reactions it sets up, its character as a menace to life appears in a much clearer light. Pity thwarts the whole law of evolution, which is the law of natural selection. It preserves whatever is ripe for destruction. It fights on the side of those disinherited and condemned by life. By maintaining life in so many of the botched of all kinds, it gives life itself a gloomy and dubious aspect. Mankind has ventured to call pity a virtue. In every superior moral system, it appears as a weakness. Going still further, it has been called the virtue, the source and foundation of all other virtues. But let us always bear in mind that this was from the standpoint of a philosophy that was nihilistic, and upon whose shield the denial of life was inscribed. Schopenhauer was right in this, that by means of pity, life is denied and made worthy of denial. Pity is the technique of nihilism. Let me repeat. This depressing and contagious instinct stands against all those instincts which work for the preservation and enhancement of life. In the role of protector of the miserable, it is a prime agent in the promotion of decadence. Pity persuades to extinction. Of course, one doesn't say extinction, one says the other world, or God, or the true life, or nirvana, salvation, blessedness. This innocent rhetoric from the realm of religious, ethical balderdash appears a good deal less innocent when one reflects upon the tendency that it conceals beneath sublime words, the tendency to destroy life. Schopenhauer was hostile to life. That is why pity appeared to him as a virtue. Aristotle, as everyone knows, saw in pity a sickly and dangerous state of mind, the remedy for which was an occasional purgative. He regarded tragedy as that purgative. The instinct of life should prompt us to seek some means of puncturing any such pathological and dangerous accumulation of pity as that appearing in Schopenhauer's case, and also, alack, that of our whole literary decadence, from St. Petersburg to Paris, from Tolstoy to Wagner, that it may be burst and discharged. Nothing is more unhealthy amid all our unhealthy modernism than Christian pity, to be the doctors here, to be unmerciful here, to wield the knife here. All this is our business. All this is our sort of humanity. By this sign we are philosophers, we Hyperboreans. Section 8. It is necessary to say just whom we regard as our antagonists: theologians, and all who have any theological blood in their veins. This is our whole philosophy. One must have faced that menace at close hand. Better still, one must have had experience of it directly and almost succumbed to it, to realize that it is not to be taken lightly. The alleged free-thinking of our naturalists and physiologists seems to me to be a joke. They have no passion about such things. They have not suffered. This poisoning goes a great deal further than most people think. I find the arrogant habit of the theologian among all who regard themselves as idealists, among all who, by virtue of a higher point of departure, claim a right to rise above reality and to look upon it with suspicion. The idealist, like the ecclesiastic, carries all sorts of lofty concepts in his hand, and not only in his hand. He launches them with benevolent contempt against understanding, the senses, honor, good living, science. He sees such things as beneath him, as pernicious and seductive forces, on which the soul soars as a pure thing in itself, as if humility, chastity, poverty, in a word, holiness, had not already done much more damage to life than all imaginable horrors and vices. The pure soul is a pure lie, so long as the priest, that professional denier, calumniator, and poisoner of life, is accepted as a higher variety of man. There can be no answer to the question, what is truth? Truth has already been stood on its head when the obvious attorney of mere emptiness is mistaken for its representative. Section 9. Upon this theological instinct I make war. I find the tracks of it everywhere. Whoever has theological blood in his veins is shifty and dishonorable in all things. The pathetic thing that grows out of this condition is called faith. In other words, closing one's eyes upon one's self once for all, to avoid suffering the sight of incurable falsehood. People erect concept of morality, of virtue, of holiness, upon this false view of all things. They ground good conscience upon faulty vision. They argue that no other sort of vision has value any more, once they have made theirs sacrosanct with the names of God, salvation, and eternity. I unearth this theological instinct in all directions. It is the most widespread and the most subterranean form of falsehood to be found on earth. Whatever a theologian regards as true must be false. There you have almost a criterion of truth. His profound instinct of self-preservation stands against truth ever coming into honor in any way, or even getting stated. Wherever the influence of theologians is felt, there is a transvaluation of values, and the concepts, true and false, are forced to change places. Whatever is most damaging to life is there called true, and whatever exalts it, intensifies it, approves it, justifies it, and makes it triumphant, is there called false. When theologians, working through the consciences of princes or of peoples, stretch out their hands for power, there is never any doubt as to the fundamental issue: the will to make an end. The nihilistic will exerts that power. Section 10. Among Germans, I am immediately understood when I say that theological blood is the ruin of philosophy. The Protestant pastor is the grandfather of German philosophy. Protestantism itself is its peccatum originale. Definition of Protestantism: hemiplegic paralysis of Christianity and of reason. One need only utter the words Tübingen School to get an understanding of what German philosophy is at bottom: a very artful form of theology. The Swabians are the best liars in Germany. They lie innocently. Why all the rejoicing over the appearance of Kant that went through the learned world of Germany, 3/4 of which is made up of the sons of preachers and teachers? Why the German conviction still echoing that with Kant came a change for the better? The theological instinct of German scholars made them see clearly just what had become possible again. A back stairs leading to the old ideal stood open. The concept of the true world, the concept of morality as the essence of the world, the two most vicious errors that ever existed, were once more, thanks to a subtle and wily skepticism, if not actually demonstrable, then at least no longer refutable. Reason, the prerogative of reason, does not go so far. Out of reality there had been made appearance, an absolutely false world, that of being had been turned into reality. The success of Kant is merely a theological success. He was, like Luther and Leibniz, but one more impediment to German integrity, already far from steady. Section 11. A word now against Kant as a moralist. A virtue must be our invention. It must spring out of our personal need and defense. In every other case, it is a source of danger. That which does not belong to our life menaces it. A virtue which has its roots in mere respect for the concept of virtue, as Kant would have it, is pernicious. Virtue, duty, good for its own sake, goodness grounded upon impersonality or a notion of universal validity, these are all chimeras, and in them one finds only an expression of the decay, the last collapse of life, the Chinese spirit of Königsberg. Quite the contrary is demanded by the most profound laws of self-preservation and of growth, to wit, that every man find his own virtue, his own categorical imperative. A nation goes to pieces when it confounds its duty with the general concept of duty. Nothing works a more complete and penetrating disaster than every impersonal duty, every sacrifice before the Moloch of abstraction. To think that no one has thought of Kant's categorical imperative as dangerous to life. The theological instinct alone took it under protection. An action prompted by the life instinct proves that it is a right action by the amount of pleasure that goes with it. And yet, that nihilist, with his bowels of Christian dogmatism, regarded pleasure as an objection. What destroys a man more quickly than to work, think, and feel without inner necessity, without any deep personal desire, without pleasure, as a mere automaton of duty? That is the recipe for decadence, and no less for idiocy. Kant became an idiot. And such a man was the contemporary of Goethe. This calamitous spinner of cobwebs passed for the German philosopher, still passes today. I forbid myself to say what I think of the Germans. Didn't Kant see in the French Revolution the transformation of the state from the inorganic form to the organic? Didn't he ask himself if there was a single event that could be explained, save on the assumption of a moral faculty in man, so that, on the basis of it, the tendency of mankind towards the good could be explained once and for all time? Kant's answer: that is revolution. Instinct at fault in everything and anything, instinct as a revolt against nature, German décadence as a philosophy, that is Kant. Section 12. I put aside a few skeptics, the types of decency in the history of philosophy. The rest haven't the slightest conception of intellectual integrity. They behave like women. All these great enthusiasts and prodigies, they regard beautiful feelings as arguments, the heaving breast as the bellows of divine inspiration, conviction as the criterion of truth. In the end, with German innocence, Kant tried to give a scientific flavor to this form of corruption, this dearth of intellectual conscience, by calling it practical reason. He deliberately invented a variety of reasons, for use on occasions when it was desirable not to trouble with reason, that is, when morality, when the sublime command, "Thou shalt," was heard. When one recalls the fact that, among all peoples, the philosopher is no more than a development from the old type of priest, this inheritance from the priest, this fraud upon self, ceases to be remarkable. When a man feels that he has a divine mission, say, to lift up, to save, or to liberate mankind, when a man feels the divine spark in his heart, and believes that he is the mouthpiece of supernatural imperatives, when such a mission inflames him, it is only natural that he should stand beyond all merely reasonable standards of judgment. He feels that he is himself sanctified by this mission, that he is himself a type of a higher order. What has a priest to do with philosophy? He stands far above it, and hitherto the priest has ruled. He has determined the meaning of true and not true. Section 13. Let us not underestimate this fact, that we ourselves, we free spirits, are already a transvaluation of all values, a visualized declaration of war and victory against all the old concepts of true and not true. The most valuable intuitions are the last to be attained. The most valuable of all are those which determine methods. All the methods, all the principles of the scientific spirit of today were the targets for thousands of years of the most profound contempt. If a man inclined to them, he was excluded from the society of decent people. He passed as an enemy of God, as a scoffer at the truth, as one possessed. As a man of science, he belonged to the Chandala, footnote, the lowest of the Hindu castes, end footnote. We have had the whole pathetic stupidity of mankind against us. Their every notion of what the truth ought to be, of what the service of the truth ought to be, their every "thou shalt" was launched against us. Our objectives, our methods, our quiet, cautious, distrustful manner, all appeared to them as absolutely discreditable and contemptible. Looking back, one may almost ask oneself with reason, if it was not actually an aesthetic sense that kept men blind for so long. What they demanded of the truth was picturesque effectiveness, and of the learned, a strong appeal to their senses. It was our modesty that stood out longest against their taste. How well they guessed that, these turkey cocks of God. Section 14. We have unlearned something. We have become more modest in every way. We no longer derive man from the Spirit, from the Godhead. We have dropped him back among the beasts. We regard him as the strongest of the beasts, because he is the craftiest. One of the results thereof is his intellectuality. On the other hand, we guard ourselves against a conceit which would assert itself even here, that man is the great second thought in the process of organic evolution. He is, in truth, anything but the crown of creation. Beside him stand many other animals, all at similar stages of development. And even when we say that, we say a bit too much, for man, relatively speaking, is the most botched of all the animals and the sickliest, and he has wandered the most dangerously from his instincts. Though for all that, to be sure, he remains the most interesting. As regards the lower animals, it was Descartes who first had the really admirable daring to describe them as machina. The whole of our physiology is directed towards proving the truth of this doctrine. Moreover, it is illogical to set man apart as Descartes did. What we know of man today is limited precisely by the extent to which we have regarded him too as a machine. Formerly, we accorded to man, as his inheritance from some higher order of beings, what was called free will. Now, we have taken even this will from him, for the term no longer describes anything that we can understand. The old word will now connotes only a sort of result, an individual reaction, that follows inevitably upon a series of partly discordant and partly harmonious stimuli. The will no longer acts or moves. Formerly, it was thought that man's consciousness, his spirit, offered evidence of his high origin, his divinity. That he might be perfected, he was advised, tortoise-like, to draw his senses in, to have no traffic with earthly things, to shuffle off his mortal coil. Then only the important part of him, the pure spirit, would remain. Here again, we have thought out the thing better. To us, consciousness, or the spirit, appears as a symptom of a relative imperfection of the organism, as an experiment, a groping, a misunderstanding, as an affliction which uses up nervous force unnecessarily. We deny that anything can be done perfectly, so long as it is done consciously. The pure spirit is a piece of pure stupidity. Take away the nervous system and the senses, the so-called mortal shell, and the rest is miscalculation. That is all. Section 15. Under Christianity, neither morality nor religion has any point of contact with actuality. It offers purely imaginary causes, God, soul, ego, spirit, free will, or even unfree, and purely imaginary effects, sin, salvation, grace, punishment, forgiveness of sins. Intercourse between imaginary beings, God, spirits, souls, an imaginary natural history, anthropocentric, a total denial of the concept of natural causes, an imaginary psychology, misunderstandings of self, misinterpretations of agreeable or disagreeable general feelings, for example of the states of the nervus sympathicus, with the help of the sign language of religio-ethical balderdash, repentance, pangs of conscience, temptation by the devil, the presence of God, an imaginary teleology, the kingdom of God, the last judgment, eternal life. This purely fictitious world, greatly to its disadvantage, is to be differentiated from the world of dreams. The latter, at least, reflects reality, whereas the former falsifies it, cheapens it, and denies it. Once the concept of nature had been opposed to the concept of God, the word natural necessarily took on the meaning of abominable. The whole of that fictitious world has its sources in hatred of the natural, the real, and is no more than evidence of a profound uneasiness in the presence of reality. This explains everything. Who alone has any reason for living his way out of reality? The man who suffers under it. But to suffer from reality, one must be a botched reality. The preponderance of pains over pleasures is the cause of this fictitious morality in religion. But such a preponderance also supplies the formula for decadence. Section 16. A criticism of the Christian concept of God leads inevitably to the same conclusion. A nation that still believes in itself holds fast to its own God. In him it does honor to the conditions which enable it to survive, to its virtues. It projects its joy in itself, its feeling of power, into a being to whom one may offer thanks. He who is rich will give of his riches. A proud people need a God to whom they can make sacrifices. Religion, within these limits, is a form of gratitude. A man is grateful for his own existence. To that end, he needs a god. Such a god must be able to work both benefits and injuries. He must be able to play either friend or foe. He is wondered at for the good he does, as well as for the evil he does. But the castration against all nature of such a god, making him a god of goodness alone, would be contrary to human inclination. Mankind has just as much need for an evil god as for a good god. It doesn't have to thank mere tolerance and humanitarianism for its own existence. What would be the value of a god who knew nothing of anger, revenge, envy, scorn, cunning, violence, who had perhaps never experienced the rapturous ardeurs of victory and of destruction? No one would understand such a god. Why should anyone want him? True enough, when a nation is on the downward path, when it feels its belief in its own future, its hope of freedom slipping from it, when it begins to see submission as a first necessity, and the virtues of submission as measures of self-preservation, then it must overhaul its god. He then becomes a hypocrite, timorous and demure. He counsels peace of soul, hate no more, leniency, love of friend and foe. He moralizes endlessly. He creeps into every private virtue. He becomes the god of every man. He becomes a private citizen, a cosmopolitan. Formerly, he represented a people, the strength of a people, everything aggressive and thirsty for power in the soul of a people. Now he is simply the good god. The truth is that there is no other alternative for gods. Either they are the will to power, in which case they are national gods, or incapacity for power, in which case they have to be good. Section 17. Wherever the will to power begins to decline, in whatever form, there is always an accompanying decline physiologically, a décadence. The divinity of this décadence, shorn of its masculine virtues and passions, is converted perforce into a god of the physiologically degraded, of the weak. Of course, they do not call themselves the weak, they call themselves the good. No hint is needed to indicate the moments in history at which the dualistic fiction of a good and an evil god first became possible. The same instinct which prompts the inferior to reduce their own god to goodness in itself, also prompts them to eliminate all good qualities from the god of their superiors. They make revenge on their masters by making a devil of the latter's god. The good god, and the devil like him, are both abortions of décadence. How can we be so tolerant of the naivete of Christian theologians as to join in their doctrine that the evolution of the concept of God, from the God of Israel, the God of a people, to the Christian God, the essence of all goodness, is to be described as progress? But even Renan does this, as if Renan had a right to be so naive. The contrary actually stares one in the face. When everything necessary to ascending life, when all that is strong, courageous, masterful, and proud has been eliminated from the concept of God, when he has sunk, step by step, to the level of a staff for the weary, a sheet anchor for the drowning, when he becomes the poor man's God, the sinner's God, the invalid's God par excellence, and the attribute of Savior or Redeemer remains as the one essential attribute of divinity. Just what is the significance of such a metamorphosis? What does such a reduction of the Godhead imply? To be sure, the kingdom of God has thus grown larger. Formerly, he had only his own people, his chosen people. But since then, he has gone wandering, like his people themselves, into foreign parts. He has given up settling down quietly anywhere. Finally, he has come to feel at home everywhere, and is the great cosmopolitan, Until now he has the great majority on his side, and half the earth. But this God of the great majority, this democrat among gods, has not become a proud heathen god. On the contrary, he remains a Jew. He remains a god in a corner, a god of all the dark nooks and crevices, of all the noisome quarters of the world. His earthly kingdom, now as always, is a kingdom of the underworld, a souterrain kingdom, a ghetto kingdom. And he himself is so pale, so weak, so décadent. Even the palest of the pale are able to master him. Messieurs the metaphysicians, those albinos of the intellect. They spun their webs around him for so long that finally he was hypnotized, and began to spin himself, and became another metaphysician. Thereafter he resumed once more his old business of spinning the world out of his inmost being, subspecies Spinozae. Thereafter he became ever thinner and paler, became the ideal, became pure spirit, became the absolute, became the thing in itself. The collapse of a god, he became a thing in itself. Section 18. The Christian concept of a god, the god as the patron of the sick, the god as a spinner of cobwebs, the god as a spirit, is one of the most corrupt concepts that has ever been set up in the world. It probably touches low water mark in the ebbing evolution of the god type. God degenerated into the contradiction of life, instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yea. In him, war is declared on life, on nature, on the will to live. God becomes the formula for every slander upon the here and now, and for every lie about the beyond. In him, nothingness is deified, and the will to nothingness is made holy. Section 19. The fact that the strong races of Northern Europe did not repudiate this Christian god does little credit to their gift for religion, and not much more to their taste. They ought to have been able to make an end of such moribund and worn-out product of the décadence. A curse lies upon them, because they were not equal to it. They made illness, decrepitude, and contradiction a part of their instincts. And since then, they've not managed to create any more gods. 2,000 years have come and gone, and not a single new god. Instead, there still exists, and as if by some intrinsic right, as if he were the ultimatum and maximum of the power to create gods, of the creator spiritus in mankind, this pitiful god of Christian monotheism, this hybrid image of decay conjured up out of emptiness, contradiction, and vain imagining, in which all the instincts of decadence, all the cowardices and wearinesses of the soul find their sanction. End sections 1 through 19. This recording is in the public domain.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kirsten Ferreri. The Antichrist, by Friedrich Nietzsche. Sections 20 through 26. Section 20. In my condemnation of Christianity, I surely hope I do no injustice to a related religion with an even larger number of believers. I allude to Buddhism. Both are to be reckoned among the nihilistic religions. They are both decadence religions, but they are separated from each other in a very remarkable way. For the fact that he is able to compare them at all, the critic of Christianity is indebted to the scholars of India. Buddhism is 100 times as realistic as Christianity. It is part of its living heritage that it is able to face problems objectively and coolly. It is the product of long centuries of philosophical speculation. The concept God was already disposed of before it appeared. Buddhism is the only genuinely positive religion to be encountered in history, and this applies even to its epistemology, which is a strict phenomenalism. It does not speak of a struggle with sin, but yielding to reality, of the struggle with suffering. Sharply differentiating itself from Christianity, it puts the self-deception that lies in moral concepts behind it. It is, in my phrase, beyond good and evil. The two physiological facts upon which it grounds itself, and upon which it bestows its chief attention, are, first, an excessive sensitiveness to sensation, which manifests itself as a refined susceptibility to pain, and secondly, an extraordinary spirituality, a too protracted concern with concepts and logical procedures, under the influence of which the instinct of personality has yielded to a notion of the impersonal. Both of these states will be familiar to a few of my readers, the objectivists, by experience, as they are to me. These physiological states produced a depression, and Buddha tried to combat it by hygienic measures. Against it he prescribed a life in the open, a life of travel, moderation in eating, and a careful selection of foods, caution in the use of intoxicants, the same caution in arousing any of the passions that foster a bilious habit and heat the blood, finally, no worry, either on one's own account or on the account of others. He encourages ideas that make for either quiet contentment or good cheer. He finds means to combat ideas of other sorts. He understands good, the state of goodness, as something which promotes health. Prayer is not included, and neither is asceticism. There is no categorical imperative, nor any disciplines, even within the walls of a monastery. It is always possible to leave. These things would have been simply means of increasing the excessive sensitiveness above mentioned. For the same reason he does not advocate any conflict with unbelievers. His teaching is antagonistic to nothing so much as revenge, aversion, resentment. Enmity never brings an end to enmity, the moving refrain of all Buddhism. And in all this he was right, for it is precisely these passions which, in view of his main regimental purpose, are unhealthful. The mental fatigue that he observes, already plainly displayed in too much objectivity, that is, in the individual's loss of interest in himself, in loss of balance and of egoism, he combats by strong efforts to lead even the spiritual interests back to the ego. In Buddha's teaching, egoism is a duty. The one thing needful, the question how you can be delivered from suffering, regulates and determines the whole spiritual diet. Perhaps one will here recall that Athenian who also declared war on pure scientificality, to wit Socrates, who also elevated egoism to the estate of a morality. Section 21. The things necessary to Buddhism are a very mild climate, customs of great gentleness and liberality, and no militarism. Moreover, it must get its start among the higher and better educated classes. Cheerfulness, quiet, and the absence of desire are the chief desiderata, and they are attained. Buddhism is not a religion in which perfection is merely an object of aspiration. Perfection is actually normal. Under Christianity, the instincts of the subjugated and the oppressed come to the fore. It is only those who are at the bottom who seek their salvation in it. Here the prevailing pastime, the favorite remedy for boredom, is the discussion of sin, self-criticism, the inquisition of conscience. Here the emotion produced by power, called God, is pumped up by prayer. Here the highest good is regarded as unattainable, as a gift, as grace. Here, too, open dealing is lacking. Concealment and the darkened room are Christian. Here body is despised and hygiene is denounced as sensual. The Church even ranges itself against cleanliness. The first Christian order after the banishment of the Moors closed the public baths, of which there were 270 in Cordoba alone. Christian, too, is a certain cruelty toward oneself and toward others, hatred of unbelievers, the will to persecute. Sombre and disquieting ideas are in the foreground. The most esteemed states of mind, bearing the most respectable names, are epileptoid. The diet is so regulated as to engender morbid symptoms and overstimulate the nerves. Christian, again, is all deadly enmity to the rulers of the earth, to the aristocratic, along with a sort of secret rivalry with them. One resigns one's body to them. One wants only one's soul. And Christian is all hatred of the intellect, of pride, of courage, of freedom, of intellectual libertinage. Christian is all hatred of the senses, of joy in the senses, of joy in general. Section 22. When Christianity departed from its native soil, that of the lowest orders, the underworld of the ancient world, and began seeking power among barbarian peoples, it no longer had to deal with exhausted men, but with men still inwardly savage and capable of self-torture, in brief, strong men, but bungled men. Here, unlike in the case of the Buddhists, the cause of discontent with self, suffering through self, is not merely a general sensitiveness and susceptibility to pain, but on the contrary, an inordinate thirst for inflicting pain on others, a tendency to obtain subjective satisfaction in hostile deeds and ideas. Christianity had to embrace barbaric concepts and valuations in order to obtain mastery over barbarians. Of such sort, for example, are the sacrifices of the firstborn, the drinking of blood as a sacrament, the disdain of the intellect and of culture, torture in all its forms, whether bodily or not, the whole pomp of the cult. Buddhism is a religion for peoples in a further state of development, for races that have become kind, gentle, and over-spiritualized. Europe is not yet ripe for it. It is a summons that takes them back to peace and cheerfulness, to a careful rationing of the spirit, to a certain hardening of the body. Christianity aims at mastering beasts of prey. Its modus operandi is to make them ill. To make feeble is the Christian recipe for taming, for civilizing. Buddhism is a religion for the closing, overwearied stages of civilization. Christianity appears before civilization has so much as begun. Under certain circumstances, it lays the very foundations thereof. Section 23. Buddhism, I repeat, is 100 times more austere, more honest, more objective. It no longer has to justify its pains, its susceptibility to suffering, by interpreting these things in terms of sin. It simply says, as it simply thinks, I suffer. To the barbarian, however, suffering in itself is scarcely understandable. What he needs first of all is an explanation as to why he suffers. His mere instinct prompts him to deny his suffering altogether, or to endure it in silence. Here the word devil was a blessing. Man had to have an omnipotent and terrible enemy. There was no need to be ashamed of suffering at the hands of such an enemy. At the bottom of Christianity there are several subtleties that belong to the Orient. In the first place, it knows that it is of very little consequence whether a thing be true or not, so long as it is believed to be true. Truth and faith. Here we have two wholly distinct worlds of ideas, almost two diametrically opposite worlds. The road to the one and the road to the other lie miles apart. To understand that fact thoroughly, this is almost enough in the Orient to make one a sage. The Brahmins knew it. Plato knew it. Every student of the esoteric knows it. When, for example, a man gets any pleasure out of the notion that he has been saved from sin, it is not necessary for him to be actually sinful, but merely to feel sinful. But when faith is thus exalted above everything else, it necessarily follows that reason, knowledge, and patient enquiry have to be discredited. The road to the truth becomes a forbidden road. Hope, in its stronger forms, is a great deal more powerful stimulants to life than any sort of realized joy can ever be. Man must be sustained in suffering by a hope so high that no conflict with actuality can dash it, so high indeed that no fulfillment can satisfy it, a hope reaching out beyond this world. Precisely because of this power that hope has of making the suffering hold out, the Greeks regarded it as the evil of evils, as the most malign of evils. It remained behind at the source of all evil, that is, in Pandora's box. In order that love may be possible, God must become a person. In order that the lower instincts may take a hand in the matter, God must be young. To satisfy the ardor of the woman, a beautiful saint must appear on the scene, and to satisfy that of the men there must be a virgin. These things are necessary if Christianity is to assume lordship over a soil on which some aphrodisiacal or Adonis cult has already established a notion as to what a cult ought to be. To insist upon chastity greatly strengthens the vehemence and subjectivity of the religious instinct. It makes the cult warmer, more enthusiastic, more soulful. Love is the state in which man sees things most decidedly as they are not. The force of illusion reaches its highest here, and so does the capacity for sweetening, for transfiguring. When a man is in love, he endures more than at any other time. He submits to anything. The problem was to devise a religion which would allow one to love. By this means, the worst that life has to offer is overcome. It is scarcely even noticed. So much for the three Christian virtues, faith, hope, and charity. I call them the three Christian ingenuities. Buddhism is in too late a stage of development, too full of positivism, to be shrewd in any such way. Section 24. Here I barely touch on the problem of the origin of Christianity. The first thing necessary to its solution is this, that Christianity is to be understood only by examining the soil from which it sprung. It is not a reaction against Jewish instincts. It is their inevitable product. It is simply one more step in the awe-inspiring logic of the Jews. In the words of the Savior, salvation is of the Jews. The second thing to remember is this, that the psychological type of the Galilean is still to be recognized. But it was only in its most degenerate form, which is at once maimed and overladen with foreign features, that it could serve in the manner in which it has been used, as a type of the Saviour of mankind. The Jews are the most remarkable people in the history of the world, for when they were confronted with the question, to be or not to be, they chose, with perfectly unearthly deliberation, to be at any price. This price involved a radical falsification of all nature, of all naturalness, of all reality, of the whole inner world, as well as of the outer. They put themselves against all those conditions under which hitherto a people had been able to live, or had even been permitted to live. Out of themselves they evolved an idea which stood in direct opposition to natural conditions. One by one they distorted religion, civilization, morality, history, and psychology, until each became a contradiction of its natural significance. We meet with the same phenomenon later on, in an incalculably exaggerated form, but only as a copy. The Christian Church, put beside the people of God, shows a complete lack of any claim to originality. Precisely for this reason the Jews are the most fateful people in the history of the world. Their influence has so falsified the reasoning of mankind in this matter, that today the Christian can cherish anti-Semitism without realizing that it is no more than the final consequence of Judaism. In my genealogy of morals, I give the first psychological explanation of the concepts underlying these two antithetical things, a noble morality and a ressentiment morality, the second of which is a mere product of the denial of the former. The Judeo-Christian moral system belongs to the second division, and in every detail. In order to be able to say nay to everything representing an ascending evolution of life, that is, to well-being, to power, to beauty, to self-approval, the instincts of ressentiment, here become downright genius, had to invent another world in which the acceptance of life appeared as the most evil and abominable thing imaginable. Psychologically, The Jews are a people gifted with the very strongest vitality, so much so that when they found themselves facing impossible conditions of life, they chose voluntarily, and with a profound talent for self-preservation, the side of all those instincts which make for decadence, not as if mastered by them, but as if detecting in them a power by which the world could be defied. The Jews are the very opposite of decadence. They have simply been forced into appearing in that guise, and with a degree of skill approaching the non plus ultra of histrionic genius, they have managed to put themselves at the head of all decadent movements, for example, the Christianity of Paul, and so make of them something stronger than any party frankly saying yes to life. To the sort of men who reach out for power under Judaism and Christianity, that is to say, to the priestly class, decadence is no more than a means to an end. Men of this sort have a vital interest in making mankind sick, and in confusing the values of good and bad, true and false, in a manner that is not only dangerous to life, but also slanders it. Section 25. The history of Israel is invaluable, as a typical history of an attempt to denaturize all natural values. I point to 5 facts which bear this out. Originally, and above all in the time of the monarchy, Israel maintained the right attitude of things, which is to say the natural attitude. Its Yahweh was an expression of its consciousness of power, its joy in itself, its hopes for itself. To him the Jews looked for victory and salvation, and through him they expected nature to give them whatever was necessary to their existence, above all, rain. Yahweh is the God of Israel, and consequently the God of justice. This is the logic of every race that has power in its hands and a good conscience in the use of it. In the religious ceremonial of the Jews both aspects of this self-approval stand revealed. The nation is grateful for the high destiny that has enabled it to obtain dominion. It is grateful for the benign procession of the seasons and for the good fortune attending its herds and crops. This view of things remained an ideal for a long while, even after it had been robbed of validity by tragic blows, anarchy within and the Assyrian without. But the people still retained, as a projection of their highest yearnings, that vision of a king who was at once a gallant warrior and an upright judge, a vision best visualized in the typical prophet, i.e. critic and satirist of the moment, Isaiah. But every hope remained unfulfilled. The old God no longer could do what he used to do. He ought to have been abandoned. But what actually happened? Simply this. The conception of him was changed. The conception of him was denaturized. That was the price that had to be paid for keeping him. Yahweh, the God of justice, he is in accord with Israel no more. He no longer visualizes the national egoism. He is now a God only conditionally. The public notion of this God becomes merely a weapon in the hands of clerical agitators who interpret all happiness as a reward, and all unhappiness as a punishment for obedience or disobedience to him, for sin, that most fraudulent of all imaginable interpretations, whereby a moral order of the world is set up, and the fundamental concepts, cause and effect, are stood on their heads. Once natural causation has been swept out of the world by the doctrines of reward and punishment, some sort of unnatural causation becomes necessary, and all other varieties of the denial of nature follow it. A God who demands, in place of a God who helps, who gives counsel, who is at bottom merely a name for every happy inspiration of courage and self-reliance. Morality is no longer a reflection of the conditions which make for the sound life and development of the people. It is no longer the primary life instinct. Instead, it has become abstract and in opposition to life, a fundamental perversion of the fancy, an evil eye on all things. What is Jewish? What is Christian morality? Chance robbed of its innocence. Unhappiness polluted with the idea of sin. Well-being represented as danger, as temptation, a physiological disorder produced by the cankerworm of conscience. Section 26. The concept of God falsified. The concept of morality falsified. But even here Jewish priestcraft did not stop. The whole history of Israel ceased to be of any value. Out with it! These priests accomplished that miracle of falsification, of which a great part of the Bible is the documentary evidence, with a degree of contempt unparalleled, and in the face of all tradition and all historical reality, they translated the past of their people into religious terms, which is to say, they converted it into an idiotic mechanism of salvation, whereby all offenses against Yahweh were punished, and all devotion to him was rewarded. We would regard this act of historical falsification as something far more shameful if familiarity with the ecclesiastical interpretation of history for thousands of years had not blunted our inclinations for uprightness in historicis. And the philosophers support the Church. The lie about a moral order of the world runs through the whole of philosophy, even the newest. What is the meaning of a moral order of the world? That there is a thing called the will of God, which once and for all time determines what man ought to do and what he ought not to do. That the worth of a people, or of an individual thereof, is to be measured by the extent to which they or he obey this will of God. That the destinies of a people or of an individual are controlled by this will of God, which rewards or punishes according to the degree of obedience manifested. In place of all that pitiful lie, reality has this to say: the priest, a parasitical variety of man, who can exist only at the cost of every sound view of life, takes the name of God in vain. He calls that state of human society in which he himself determines the value of all things the kingdom of God. He calls the means whereby that state of affairs is attained the will of God. With cold-blooded cynicism he estimates all people, all ages, and all individuals by the extent of their subservience or opposition to the power of the priestly order. One observes him at work. Under the hand of the Jewish priesthood, the great age of Israel became an age of decline. The exile, with its long series of misfortunes, was transformed into a punishment for that great age, during which priests had not yet come into existence. Out of the powerful and wholly free heroes of Israel's history they fashioned, according to their changing needs, either wretched bigots and hypocrites, or men entirely godless. They reduced every great event to the idiotic formula, obedient or disobedient to God. They went a step further. The will of God, in other words, some means necessary for preserving the power of the priests, had to be determined, and to this end they had to have a revelation. In plain English, a gigantic literary fraud had to be perpetrated, and holy scriptures had to be concocted. And so, with utmost hierarchical pomp, and days of penance and much lamentation over the long days of sin now ended, they were duly published. The will of God, it appears, had long stood like a rock. The trouble was that mankind had neglected the Holy Scriptures. But the will of God had already been revealed to Moses. What happened? Simply this: the priest had formulated, once and for all time, and with the strictest meticulousness, what tithes were to be paid to him, from the largest to the smallest, not forgetting the most appetizing cuts of meat, for the priest is a great consumer of beefsteaks. In brief, he let it be known just what he wanted, what the will of God was. From this time forward, things were so arranged that the priest became indispensable everywhere, at all the great natural events of life, at birth, at marriage, in sickness, at death, not to say at the sacrifice, that is, at meal-times. The holy parasite put in his appearance, and proceeded to denaturize it, in his own phrase, to sanctify it. For this should be noted, that every natural habit, every natural institution, the state, the administration of justice, marriage, the care of the sick and of the poor, everything demanded by the life instinct, in short, everything that has any value in itself, is reduced to absolute worthlessness, and even made the reverse of valuable by the parasitism of priests, or, if you choose, by the moral order of the world. The fact requires a sanction. A power to grant values becomes necessary, and the only way it can create such values is by denying nature. The priest depreciates and desecrates nature. It is only at this price that he can exist at all. Disobedience to God, which actually means to the priest, to the law, now gets the name of sin. The means prescribed for reconciliation with God are, of course, precisely the means which bring one most effectively under the thumb of the priest. He alone can save. Psychologically considered, sins are indispensable to every society organized on an ecclesiastical basis. They are the only reliable weapons of power. The priest lives upon sins. It is necessary to him that there be sinning. Prime axiom: God forgiveth him that repenteth. In plain English, him that submitteth to the priest. End of sections 20 through 26.